Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I hope you're having a great week. I'd like to discuss Natural Histories by Primo Levi, which is a collection of science fiction short stories from Levi. And that's not, of course, what I had ever known Primo Levi was writing, but they're fantastic. They were written and published for the most part in the 1960s, and they're a very strong collection of stories. Levi was trained as a chemist, and so that informs his science fiction writing. But of course, one of the main, sort of themes of a lot of science fiction, particularly in the middle of the 20th century, was the fear of advancing technology, the ways in which increased mechanization, new technologies dehumanized societies. And that is a fear that Levi is absolutely tapping into in these stories, but it's also informed by his own experiences as a Holocaust survivor. So he was Jewish, he was a secular Jew, but he was nevertheless imprisoned at Auschwitz and witnessed thousands of murders. And so he is, of course, most famous for his Holocaust memoirs, the first one being If This Is a Man, also published in volume 1 of his complete works with Natural Histories. And so that is what he is justifiably most famous for, are his memoirs and his fight for people to understand just how horrifying the Holocaust was. And that taps into the science fiction he writes. He views advancing technology from the perspective of a person who saw just how horrifying it can lead to, the horrors it can lead to when it's applied for evil purposes. And so that's in his stories, but they're not overwhelmingly horrifying. Usually there's this acerbic wit, this very dark humor underneath it. And so, for example, a number of the stories deal with the same corporation, which we again think of within science fiction, NATCA, NATCA, and specifically Mr. Simpson, who's always this salesman for whatever new device NATCA has produced. It starts out, a little bit simpler with something called the versifier that you can program it and it will create little limericks and ads and even a eulogy or an ode that's a eulogy for someone. You can pick the different styles and subjects and the meter and things, and so they try that out, and they get different devices that will then copy text and things like that. So it seems harmless, and then a couple stories later we get a new one, a new NATCA story, and it's got a device that can basically replicate something. And so what if I replicate a bunch of diamonds? Throughout those stories, there's always this moment where Levi wants to show just how greedy and avaricious characters can be. And I think that was something that we see those comments on the greed in North American and European society periodically. Like we think of Arthur Miller and certain other writers who want to talk about the way in which people are just sort of, give me the cash. Levi's doing that, but he does it very quickly, just a couple of lines, and then we're moving on. And then ultimately, could you use that replicator not just to replicate diamonds, but to replicate a butterfly or a cat if you have a big enough chamber, or something even larger? And what happens then? So we have those stories, but ultimately we get into the final story, Retirement Package, where the company has come up with a virtual reality device. And Levi describes it in detail. It's a helmet you put on, and then you plug in this tape, and it instead of your memories existing, what you get are the memories that are from the tape going through the helmet into your mind. And it's, the first one is they're out in a soccer game, and you score a goal, and how exciting is that? And one of the characters notes, yeah, but right as he was about to score the goal, he was thinking about this woman he was about to go on a date with that night. Like, that was interesting. And then there's another, tape, and then another one that involves a loop of different characters who are very thirsty, finally getting a drink of water. And ultimately what happens, of course, are that people become addicted to the virtual reality. They don't have their own memories. They have no memory of it. They just want it. They want that fix. And so Levi is, of course, commenting on the ways in which entertainment and media will, just lull us into distractions in a very effective way. But we have all of those stories, the measure of beauty in which a device can be pre-programmed to identify, like, this is the most beautiful human face and figure for a certain person. So now everybody else can be scaled on that. And, I'm only a 23, but that's if I shave and I'm in this light. Otherwise, I can't break 20. look, you're only a 28, and then it turns out to be a great success, and I won't say why, but it turns out for a very like narcissistic reason to be a great success. But there are a couple of stories that comment on ideas around religion, and specifically the book of Genesis. So one of the stories is an argument between the different engineers during creation. It's called the sixth day. And they get a run out of what they're supposed to design for this man and all the things they've got to figure out. And they debate, should it be a reptile? Should it be a fish? Should it be underwater? Well, living things that are underwater don't communicate very well. So that doesn't meet this qualification. So it can't be underwater. And they end up trying to decide, should it be a bird or a mammal? And then it has a surprise little twist at the ending. But the other one that's really funny deals with sort of with centaurs and a time for what really happened after the flood with Noah. Remarkably, their traditions also begin with a highly intelligent man, a Noah-like inventor and savior, whom they call Kut-Nofeset. But there were no centaurs on Kut-Nofeset's ark, nor, by the way, were there 7 pairs of every species of clean beast and a pair of every species of the beasts that are not clean. The Centaurian tradition is more rational than the biblical, recounting that only the archetypal animals, the key species, were saved: man but not the monkey, the horse but not the donkey or the wild ass, the rooster and the crow but not the vulture or the hoopoe or the gyrfalcon. How then did these species come about? Immediately afterward, legend says, when the waters retreated, a deep layer of warm mud covered the earth. Now this mud, which harbored in its decay all the enzymes from what had perished in the flood, was extraordinarily fertile. As soon as it was touched by the sun, it was immediately covered in shoots from which grasses and plants of every type sprang forth, and even more, within its soft and moist bosom, it was host to the marriage of all the species saved in the ark. It was a time never again to be repeated, of wild, ecstatic fecundity in which the entire universe felt love, so much so that it nearly returned to chaos. Those were the days in which the earth itself fornicated with the sky, in which everything germinated and everything was fruitful. Not only every marriage, but every union, every contact, every encounter, even fleeting, even between different species, even between beasts and stones, even between plants and stones, was fertile, and produced offspring, not in a few months, but in a few days. The sea of warm mud which concealed the cold and prudish face of the earth was a single, immense nuptial bed, boiling over with desire in all its recesses and teeming with jubilant gems. This second creation was the true creation. So Levi is going for it in these stories, and many of them are incredibly effective, and they absolutely provide a different perspective on Levi as a writer. We so often think of him with his fabulous and absolutely essential memoirs. And we think of him perhaps for the periodic table, his great sequence of stories written about 10 years after these. But these earlier stories, just there is a sense of humor underneath them after all the horrors he had been through. And I find that to just be extraordinary. And I'm very appreciative that I had the chance to read these. So I highly recommend them, although I think they're only available in his complete works. I think available in full in English translation in his complete works. And I was reminded of different writers. I was reminded of the way Ray Bradbury thinks around technology, even in stories like A Sound of Thunder. And Bradbury, of course, has like Golden Apples of the Sun, a very humorous story. But then A Sound of Thunder shows just how frightening, and terrifying those technologies could be, the consequences that could occur. Levi, I think, was also, and was explicitly, owned that he was informed by Kafka. And the horrors of Kafka aren't necessarily here, but that sense of potential for alienation that Levi is exploring is an alienation that is achieved within many of Kafka's stories, I would say. I was also reminded, of course, of Robert Sheckley's fantastic stories, mostly from the 1950s, but they feel so comparable. Sheckley's stories are much more humorous, but the dry humor that Levi has is very, very analogous. I was reminded of Cosmicomics from Italo Calvino. I think Levi's stories are much stronger than these. I wasn't a huge fan. But the ways in which Levi, as a chemist, applied his understanding of science, his understanding of the corporate side of chemistry and the industrial side of chemistry, is something that I think Calvino was trying for and didn't quite achieve in Cosmicomics. I also was reminded of Richard Matheson, who is often more of a horror writer than a science fiction writer, but I think Levi was tapping into that side of science fiction as well. And then finally, I couldn't help but think of the great Umberto Eco, and the ways in which Levi brings, you know, so many different aspects of his own experiences, his training, but the experiences he had, you know, in Auschwitz to bear on these stories, and the ways in which Eco is, of course, pulling from so many different types of learning when he creates his works, such as in Foucault's Pendulum. So I'm going to continue reading Levi. I might be reading If This Is a Man later on in November. But Natural Histories was a great surprise and a very pleasant surprise. So I'm curious if you've ever read any of his other works, and if there are any that you're a particular fan of. So I hope everybody's doing well. Thank you.